Hello everybody, welcome to today's lecture. Today we are going to look at what is known as the Japanese American Internment, a policy that was put into place in February of 1942 after President Franklin Roosevelt signed an executive order numbered 9066 authorizing all West Coast Japanese Americans, both immigrants from Japan as well as American citizens, to be rounded up and placed into what the government called internment camps, what the Japanese called concentration camps. I use the term internment here in my title to sort of provide some continuity with what the government and mainstream textbooks call it, but I will refer to them in this lecture as concentration camps because the Japanese refer to them as concentration camps, and definitionally they are concentration camps. Okay, they are not concentration camps in the same way as the Nazi concentration camps, but as we will see, the process was similar in some ways and dissimilar in many others. Okay, but this is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. This is a topic that I spent multiple years studying, wrote my master's thesis on. I've interviewed many Japanese Americans who were put into concentration camps during World War II. And like the Holocaust, I view this as a war crime. It was a crime against American citizens and others who were accused of doing something wrong when in fact they had not done anything wrong and they were incarcerated. Okay, so we're going to go through this and we're going to talk about the history of it briefly, and then hopefully this will be something that you can think about, and maybe we have some life lessons to learn from it. So with that sort of said, let's dive right into this subject. Okay. Alright, it says here that the attack upon Pearl Harbor played a monumental role in bringing the United States into World War II, right? And it shattered America's ideas of neutrality. We saw that in the last lecture with World War II. Clearly, December 7th, 1941 propelled the United States into war, and that war had an impact on the home front. It had an impact militaristically, okay, but it also had an impact on the Japanese Americans. Okay, this was a minority group in the United States who had habitually been viewed as inferior. This was a group of people who historically West Coast Anglo-Americans had attempted to subvert and keep out of the nation. And as I will argue, and as I have argued, I believe that the concentration of Japanese Americans during World War II had much to do with the fact that there was a great deal of racism against Japanese Americans in the West Coast at the time. This thing goes on to state that beyond this, the attack opened up Pandora's box as it concerned Anglo-Japanese American relations, and it led to one of the greatest injustices in American history: the concentration of 112,000 West Coast Japanese Americans. Okay? Now I stress this idea of the West Coast. It was West Coast Japanese Americans who were removed, not all Japanese Americans. And I'm going to come back to that truth here in a second, but just gnaw on that for a while and ask yourself the question: if Japanese Americans were perceived to be a great threat, which was the reason what the government gave to the people to explain why they incarcerated Japanese Americans, the government said the reason why we put them into camps is because there are saboteurs, they are dangerous, they could be spies working for Japan. Okay? The truth of the matter is that if the government truly believed that the Japanese as a race of people, both American citizens and non-American citizens, if they believed that they were an enemy people or potentially dangerous, then they should have rounded up every single one of the Japanese Americans in the United States, not just those on the West Coast. And so it begs the question, why did they just round up those on the West Coast? And again, my answer to that is that there is a great deal of racism in the United States at this time against Japanese Americans specifically, but Asian Americans generally. Now, there are two groups of people who were placed into these concentration camps, and in total, there were 10 concentration camps in the United States. Okay? The two groups of people who were placed into these camps were, one, you had a group known as Issei, and this term Issei is a term that Americans have given to Japanese American immigrants and various generations of Japanese Americans. So Issei are first generation Japanese Americans. The Issei were born in Japan, educated in Japan, and emigrated to the United States. Okay? The Issei were not citizens of the United States, and in fact, the Issei could not become citizens of the United States because the law in the United States did not allow for them to actually gain citizenship. According to the law in the United States, going as far back as 1790, it was made quite clear that citizenship was only for, quote, free white persons. And Japanese were not considered white persons, and thus the Issei, even if they had wanted to become American citizens, were barred from becoming U.S. citizens. And thus, the United States viewed the Issei, these first generation Japanese Americans, as enemy aliens during World War II and aliens, generally speaking. So that's one group of people placed into these camps. The other group of people were the Nisei, and the Nisei were American citizens. They were the children of the Issei. The Nisei were born into the United States, okay, and had American citizenship. They had grown up in this region, right? Their homeland was the United States. Many of them spoke English predominantly, albeit they did go to Japanese schools where they retained some of their ethnic ancestral heritage, right? But they are American citizens, okay? Of the 112 or so thousand Japanese Americans who were put into the camps, 75,000 of them were American citizens, okay? The reason they were placed into the camps was because they happened to look like the enemy. But they were not the enemy. They were American citizens, okay? And these are the groups of people who are placed into the camps, okay? Now, when does this happen? Well, it actually happens rather quickly. In fact, if you were a male Issei, so if you were a male first-generation Japanese American, the FBI actually came to your house the day of Pearl Harbor and removed you and took you to some temporary camp, okay? Later on, however, there would be a mass forced migration into these camps. And as mentioned before, that forced migration began when President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, which he did on February 19th, 1942. And what this did was it authorized the removal of West Coast Japanese Americans into various camps, okay? Now I'm going to read to you from a book called Encyclopedia of Japanese American History. And it says this about Executive Order 9066. It says, signed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt on February 19, 1942, Executive Order 9066 authorized the War Department to prescribe military zones from which any or all persons may be excluded. The right of any person to enter, remain in, or leave those areas was at the discretion of the military authorities. In other words, 9066, which actually did not mention Japanese Americans by name, but only affected them, 9066 allowed the War Department to create militarized zones where they could move people in and out at their discretion. Okay? It says this order, which on the surface made no reference to Japanese Americans, served as the basis for the future curfew and exclusion orders issued by Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt and the mass incarceration of all West Coast Japanese Americans in concentration camps. It was not rescinded until President Gerald Ford did it exactly 34 years later. Okay? And so Pearl Harbor creates an acrid environment, an environment where fear overwhelmed good judgment, a fear that Japanese Americans were going to hurt people, but more importantly, this fear was racially motivated. I argue that in the West Coast, Americans had a Japanese American problem in the same way that Hitler had a Jewish problem. Okay? Now, of course, we don't systematically kill Japanese Americans, but there is this racial hatred towards Japanese Americans because they are viewed as the proverbial other. They do not fit into what we call the normative whiteness mentality, right? It is not uncommon to see Japanese Americans today, even third and fourth generation Japanese Americans, and people will ask them all the time, where are you from? Well, I'm from Pittsburgh, right? That kind of thing, right? These Nisei were as much American citizens as anybody else, okay? But they were put into these camps by Executive Order 9066, okay? All right, let's move on. Okay, at the time, the United States government stated that the incarceration of the Japanese Americans was done for their safety, okay? Right? And that the reason why it was done was to protect American interests, okay? In fact, it was also stated that it was done to protect Japanese Americans from Anglo-American hostilities, okay? So it says here that it was done for the safety and well-being of Japanese people in the United States. Again, it was also stated that some of these, and in fact you'll see watching a film here in a second, that the government will say that we knew that some of them were dangerous. And the truth of the matter is that none of them ever were convicted of having committed a crime, right? Ultimately, the larger American population was told that this was done as a way to protect the U.S. from hostilities enacted by Anglo-Americans. I write here that while some truth might be found in such reckoning, it is clear that the reason behind implementing the internment was racism, and the history of American relations with Japanese in country clearly validates that point. And when I say Japanese Americans in country, I mean once the Japanese Americans, both Issei and Nisei, once they arrived here in the United States, or once they were born into the United States, the laws of the United States were prohibitive. They were restrictive. They were created as a means to keep Japanese Americans from coming into the nation, or to keep them from practicing full civil liberties. Japanese Americans, like many other minority groups in the United States, were treated as second-class citizens. Okay? And I've already alluded to this, but at the core of many Anglo-Americans' thinking was that the Nisei weren't even Americans. They were Japanese, right? It didn't matter that you had been born in the United States. It didn't matter that your citizenship was in the United States. When many Anglo-Americans looked at Japanese Americans and other Asian Americans, right, the initial thought was that they must be from Asia, not from the United States, okay? And so, you know, the reality is that what the government is saying is not true. And what I want you to do is click on this word point, and this is an incredibly important video to watch. It's in my head a piece of propaganda, where you're going to hear a gentleman by the name of Eisenhower, and it's not Dwight D. Eisenhower, but a gentleman named Eisenhower. He's going to explain, and I put the word explain in quotation marks, he's going to explain why the government chose to put the Japanese Americans into concentration camps. I think he's completely wrong, completely false, and what's to follow after this slide is going to be essentially my rebuttal to him. Okay, I don't think we put Japanese Americans into concentration camps for their own protection. I don't think we put Japanese Americans into concentration camps because some of them were working with the Japanese to attack the United States. That's what you're going to hear in this video. I believe we did it because Anglo-Americans had a general hatred and racial attitude toward Asian Americans generally and Japanese Americans specifically, okay? But go ahead and watch that film now and then move on to the next slide. Okay, recall that on the previous slide I mentioned that many Anglo-Americans had this perception that Japanese Americans, or the Nisei, were not American citizens, okay? In my research I came across the following quote from a Japanese American Nisei who said this, and her name was Akiko Kurose. And she said, quote, "And then when I went back to school that following morning, December 8th, one of the teachers said, 'You people bombed Pearl Harbor.' And I'm going, 'My people.' All of a sudden my Japaneseness became very aware to me, and that I no longer felt I'm an equal American," right? This is an example of the mentality of many Anglo-Americans, right? Akiko Kurose was born in the United States. Citizenship was the United States. She spoke English. She went to American schools. And yet, on December 8th, she is accused of her people bombing the United States at Pearl Harbor, and she's saying, look, there's something fundamentally flawed with this thinking, right? My people did not bomb the United States because my people are Americans, not Japanese, right? I may be of Japanese ancestry, but they are not my people. And this sort of underscores that racial attitude which pervaded, as we will see, much of American society. Okay? It says here that delineating Anglo and Japanese Americans has a racial history. Okay? And ever since the late 1890s, when the Issei first began to immigrate to the United States, Anglo-Americans did all they could to both hinder that migration and keep Japanese Americans and their children from practicing basic human rights. Thus, racism had always been part of the Japanese American experience. Okay? And there are a number of examples that I could point to. Okay? I could go on for hours giving you examples of the way that Japanese Americans were treated, mistreated, and regarded as somewhat second class or inferior, but I've chose only to demonstrate 3 here for you. Okay? Historically speaking, the Japanese Americans, or the Issei, first migrated to the United States in the latter part of the 1890s, maybe a little bit earlier than that. And when they got here, they entered into an environment where West Coast Americans, largely those in California, there was already animosity towards Asians, predominantly towards Chinese Americans and Chinese themselves. And in fact, in 1882, the United States passed a law known as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which banned Chinese immigration forever in the United States, ultimately forever. It was indefinitely, and then it continued to be placed back into authority. Okay, so by the time the Japanese Americans arrive, the West Coast Americans already have a hatred towards Asian Americans, right? And then all of a sudden, the Japanese show up, right? And in fact, I remember reading a quote from a senator. The senator name was Cassidy, was the last name, and this senator said that the Japanese are beginning the same tide of immigration we thought we solved a decade ago. Okay? In other words, he's saying, look, we thought we dealt with these Asian Americans already. We thought we dealt with these Asians by passing the Chinese Exclusion Act, but now we have all these Japanese Americans showing up. What are we supposed to do with them? Okay? And that's sort of the mindset. That's sort of the mentality of many West Coast Americans when the Japanese arrive. Okay? So when the Japanese arrive, they largely become farmers. They settle in places like California, San Francisco, Seattle are large hubs of Japanese American populations. Okay? And the animosity that had once been appropriated towards Chinese Americans and Chinese themselves are now going to be placed upon Japanese, right? And one of the things that happens is that Japanese Americans in 1907, these Nisei, actual American citizens, many of them will be removed from mainstream American public schools and placed into segregated all Japanese schools. Now this is an interesting thing because there's this idea, this belief, which is a false belief, I believe, in American history that, you know, we want immigrants to assimilate. We want them to become good Americans. Well, if you want them to become good Americans, then the best place to, I suppose, to do that is to put them into American schools where you can educate them in American values, American history, American ethics, right? That kind of thing. If your objective is to have them assimilate, then why would you remove them into segregated all Japanese schools? That's an interesting question, right? Not one I'm going to give you an answer to right now, but just something to think about. But many Nisei get removed from these public schools and they get put into these all segregated schools. Well, this action gets to gets to Japan itself, and the relationship between the United States and Japan becomes tenuous because Japan recognizes that this is a very racialized action. And so in order to deal with this, the United States and Japan come to an agreement. Okay, they come to an agreement known as the Gentleman's Agreement of 1907. Okay, and let me read to you again from the Encyclopedia of Japanese American History, and this is what it says. It says, Gentleman's Agreement 1908 agreement between Japan and the United States that halted Japanese labor migration to the United States. So what did the gentleman's agreement do? It stopped and halted Japanese laborers from migrating to the United States. Okay. It says, negotiated at the highest levels of their respective governments, the gentleman's agreement between Japan and the United States was the result of a series of events stemming from the San Francisco School Board's segregation order of 1906. In fact, San Francisco, I remember reading in a newspaper one time, posted something in the paper that said something to the effect of, if the Southerners can segregate their schools, then why can't we? Right? The segregation order came in 1906. Teddy Roosevelt is behind this order, and then again, eventually it gets back to Japan. So the gentleman's agreement is this: the United States will place the Japanese Americans back into public schools, but Japan has to stop granting visas and exit visas to Japanese laborers. Okay? Now the question is, why would the United States want to limit Japanese American immigration? Why do they not want laborers from Japan coming into the United States? Well, there's a number of answers to that question. You know, there is the fear among many that Japanese Americans are competing with Anglo-Americans for jobs. They're taking those jobs at lower rates, right? There is a fear that Japanese Americans are the proverbial other, that their culture is going to somehow denigrate and destroy American values and ethics. But underneath all of this is a very just strong sense of, we don't like Japanese Americans. There's a strong racism that's attendant with it. Okay? And so the gentleman's agreement is one example of the way in which the United States attempted to limit their migration. Okay? Once they got here, these Japanese Americans, as aforementioned, became farmers. Well, in 1913 and again in 1920, the United States is going to bar Issei, and remember the Issei are first-generation Japanese Americans. They're going to bar them from owning land, and they do this by passing two land laws. The first is the land law of 1913, and the second is the land law of 1920. What I would like for you to do is, actually, there's a link there which takes you to a webpage where you can read about these land laws. But essentially what it was is that because the Japanese Americans, the Issei, were competing with Anglo-Americans for land, okay, what the government did was that it passed a law that said if you cannot have citizenship, then you can't own land, right? If you are ineligible for citizenship, you can't own land. Well, the Issei were ineligible for citizenship again because the United States would not allow them to become U.S. citizens. Okay, so the Issei got smart about it, and they realized that their children, the Nisei, were in fact American citizens. So what they started doing was they started leasing the land out in the name of their children. Okay, well, in 1920, they passed another law which effectively said that they couldn't do that either. Okay, and again, the question is, why would the United States or various state and local governments pass these types of regulatory laws? Right? Why would you do that? Again, the idea is make life unbearable for them. Make life difficult for them, and then maybe they'll leave. Okay? And then finally, in 1924, we passed the Japanese Exclusion Act, which was actually part of a much larger immigration law which was passed in 1924. But this effectively excluded all Japanese from coming into the United States. Now, you can read more about those, and I would encourage you to do so by just clicking on those two links. But this should give you a sense of the type of history that the Japanese Americans, both Issei and Nisei, experienced within the United States. Okay? And to argue, as the U.S. government did, that the reason why we put these people into camps was because they were dangerous or we were protecting them, that's asinine. It's absurd. We just didn't like Japanese Americans and were making life difficult for them. Okay? All right, let's move on. It says here that racial legislation was not the only evidence one can turn to in order to illustrate the racial environment that Japanese Americans lived in, and which ultimately caused the concentration of them into camps. For example, it says, running on a Keep America White campaign, San Francisco Mayor James D. Phelan epitomized this racial attitude and did all he could to keep Japanese Americans, citizens or no, from experiencing the promise of America. And he said, the Japanese are starting the same tide of immigration which we thought we had checked 20 years ago. Okay, and I want to apologize. I attributed this quote to a senator named Cassidy on the last slide. I apologize for that. This quote actually came from James D. Phelan. So, correction, okay? But Phelan says, the Japanese are starting the same tide of immigration which we thought we had checked 20 years ago. The Chinese and Japanese are not bona fide citizens. Now, he makes no distinction here. Phelan does not say Japanese Americans. He doesn't say Japanese Japanese Americans of Japanese ancestry or Americans of Japanese ancestry. He simply says Chinese and Japanese. It doesn't matter if you had been here for decades and decades or if you were fresh off the boat. Chinese and Japanese, he says, are not bona fide citizens. They are not the stuff of which American citizens can be made. They will not assimilate with us. Let them keep at a respectful distance. And when Phelan says they will not assimilate with us, he means white Protestant Americans. Okay? Now, I don't suspect that any politician could run on a campaign like this today and get away with it, but James D. Phelan did. And what that means and what that suggests, in fact, more than suggests, is that this type of rationale thinking, or irrational thinking if you want, right? This was something that mainstream Americans would have adhered to because they were the ones who elected him to the mayorship, right? It's an incredibly significant statement, okay? And I think it's something that we need to be pondering on, okay? All right, let's move forward. All right, it says immediately after the attack, and I mentioned this once before, but immediately following the attack at Pearl Harbor, FBI agents removed Issei men from their homes and placed them into temporary holding centers without ever charging them of a crime. Now, note, the Issei are not U.S. citizens. According to the FBI, they are now enemy aliens. They had always been aliens because they couldn't become U.S. citizens, but now they're enemy aliens, and they are instantly removed from their homes. People just show up, knock on the door. Is Mr. Yamamoto here? Yeah, well, he's coming with us. Your family may not know where he is, and they may not know for some time. Okay? Now, eventually, this process is going to be extended to all Japanese Americans on the West Coast, again, through the Executive Order 9066. Okay? But it's also important to recognize that for most Americans, they referred to Japanese as this. They would say a Jap is a Jap, and the term Jap is an incredibly racialized slur. Okay? It's the equivalent of any other racialized slur you can think of appropriated towards Japanese Americans, right? And basically, and we saw this from James D. Phelan's comment that, right, the Chinese and Japanese, they are not like us, right? They cannot assimilate, okay? Many Americans held this attitude. Now, how do I know that they held this attitude? We'll move on to the next slide. You ready? How do I know that many Americans held this attitude? We can take a look at this picture here. Japs keep moving. This is a white man's neighborhood. And on the side of the house, Japs keep out. You are not wanted. Right? I mean, that's a sobering picture. To contemplate this. To understand that Anglo-Americans, white Americans, they viewed Japanese Americans and Japanese immigrants as so far inferior that it didn't matter how many generations of Japanese Americans there were. It didn't matter how much assimilation you had made. You know, you could be eating hamburgers, listening to country music, and, you know, dressing in blue jeans, but you were not an American, right? You are still a Japanese, or what they would call a Jap, okay? And it's very difficult, and again, I harp on this, but it's very difficult to try to harmonize the type of racial environment that Japanese Americans, and again, Asian Americans in general, experienced in the United States, and reconcile that with the argument that the government is giving about why they've placed them into camps, right? They placed them into camps because, as this sign says, they need to keep moving. This is a white man's neighborhood. You need to keep moving. The United States is a white man's country, okay? I could go on and on about this. I think I've beat that horse to death. So let's just move on. Okay, so how does this process work? Once the Executive Order 9066 is put into place, how are Japanese dealt with? It says at the outset, at the beginning, the Japanese were sent to assembly centers. Now, an assembly center is a temporary holding facility, okay, that the Issei and Nisei were placed into. These assembly centers were hastily constructed. Oftentimes they were located at racetracks because there were already quote-unquote barracks there, otherwise known as horse stalls, right, where you could put this human cargo. And generally when you were moved into these assembly centers, and then again later into the much more permanent concentration camps, you were not given much time to move. You were given maybe 2-3 days notice, and you had to sell all that you had. You could only take with you what you could carry. Okay? It says here that the barracks which the Japanese were moved into were hastily constructed, and oftentimes many families would be put into one small room in order to live. Okay? It says located across the entire United States, these centers were located in sanctioned military zones, and those who inhabited them were oftentimes moved there with only a day's notice. Right? How is it if you own a farm? How is it if you have a company? How is it if you own a truck, a car, a house? How is it that you're supposed to reap any profit off of this in a single day? Right? You're simply uprooted from where you're at, and you're forced to move into these assembly centers to live because, according to the government, you're potentially dangerous. Right? And again, not a single Japanese American was ever convicted of a crime, Issei or Nisei. No one. And it's astonishing and astounding to think how it is that the United States could simply uproot these people, and particularly American citizens, and violate their civil liberties in such a gross, acrid way. Right? Remove them from their homes and, move on to the next page, place them into a camp known as the Tan Foran Center or other centers. The Tan Foran Center was just one of the assembly centers that the Japanese Americans were placed into. Okay? It says here that evacuation orders were posted in Japanese American communities giving instructions on how to comply with the executive order. It says many families sold their homes, their stores, and most of their assets, and if you couldn't sell them, you simply had to abandon them. Some families gave them to friends to watch over, and a lot of times those homes, those cars, those farms were no longer there when they returned home. It says these Japanese Americans, both Issei and Nisei, could not be certain their homes and livelihoods would still be there upon their return. Because of the mad rush to sell, properties and inventories were often sold at a fraction of what they were actually valued at. Okay? And so they are initially removed, and the Tan Foran Center is just one of the many assembly centers that they were moved to. Alright, let's move on. Okay, what you're looking at here is a racetrack. Okay, but it was also a assembly center. This is the Tan Foran Center that we mentioned. Okay, not a whole lot to see there. Let's move on to the next picture. This too is part of the Tan Foran Center, but these are horse stalls, and this became your new home. Okay, and when you got in there, they may give you a sack with some straw to sleep on. Now, one of the things I want to make quite clear, and I want to make a very clean distinction. Yes, the United States is violating human rights. Yes, the United States is violating civil liberties, particularly and specifically for the 75,000 Japanese Americans, or Nisei, who they're putting into these camps. Yes, living conditions were not good. Things were difficult and harsh. All of that said, these camps, these assembly centers, they are nothing like the ghettos. They are nothing like the death camps under Nazi reign in Poland and Germany. Okay? We are not systematically starving Japanese Americans. We are not systematically working them to death. We are not systematically killing them. In these camps, life went on. Things were difficult for sure. Things were unfair for sure. But I do not want us to associate these concentration camps with those of the Nazis. They are different or dissimilar in many ways. The way that they are similar, however, is that people were treated inhumanely. American citizens were treated without regard to their civil liberties. And they were not necessarily treated well. And by that, I mean, look at the types of conditions or the places where you're asked to sleep. Okay? All right, moving forward. Some information on the Tanforan Center. It says the Tanforan Assembly Center was located at the Tanforan Racetrack in San Bruno, which was 12 miles south of San Francisco. Occupied from April 28th to October 13th, the Assembly Center held 8,033 evacuees, or at least it could hold up to that number. It never actually held its total capacity. It actually only ever held 7,816 inmates or people at one time. Okay? It says the Assembly Center had about 130 barracks, half within the racetrack infield. It says in addition, stables were used to house evacuees, as was also the case at the Santa Anita racetrack. Okay? And you saw those horse stalls that people would have been remaining in. Now again, these are temporary holding centers. Eventually, a new executive order is going to be passed, creating something called the War Relocation Authority. And once the War Relocation Authority is created, then the more permanent concentration camps will be constructed, and the Japanese Americans, both Issei and Nisei, will be moved from these assembly centers into those more established concentration camps. Okay, moving forward. Alright, it says these initial evacuations, so these moves, these forced migrations into the assembly centers were overseen by General DeWitt. Okay, and General DeWitt, like most Americans, at least specifically those on the American West Coast, right? He viewed the Japanese as an enemy race. He views Japanese Americans, even the Nisei, as being an enemy race, right? He does not distinguish the fact that they are U.S. citizens. He simply says, right here, quote, racial affinities are not severed by migration. In other words, it doesn't matter if you're a second or third generation Japanese American. All that matters is that your heritage is Japanese, and therefore that's what you are. He says the Japanese race is an enemy race. And while many second and third generation Japanese born on U.S. soil have become Americanized, their racial strains are undiluted. Okay? In other words, there's no amount of assimilation that can undilute their Japanese stain. They are an enemy, right? And this is the man overseeing these forced evacuations from their home into these assembly centers. I mean, that's unreal, right? This is a man who's clearly not going to treat Nisei with any respect, any more than he's going to treat the Issei with any respect. Okay? It says on March 18th, 1942, however, President Roosevelt passed Executive Order 9102, which created the War Relocation Authority, which I had just mentioned to you, what we refer to as the WRA. Okay, the War Relocation Authority, and therefore Japanese were relocated to concentration camps around the United States. Most of them were on the West Coast. A few hit further east. Okay. It says in total 10 camps were created, 2 of which were located in my home state of California, and perhaps many of you are from California as well. One of the camps was called Manzanar. It's actually one of the more popular and well-known camp. And this is in the east central portion of the United States. If you've ever been towards Mammoth or driven through up to Mammoth, then you've driven right by Manzanar. And then the other one is called Tule Lake, which actually became a segregation center in, I believe it was 1943. It started off as a concentration camp, and then it became a segregation center because in an attempt to figure out who was loyal and who was disloyal, the United States really made some errors, and they classified a bunch of Japanese as being disloyal American citizens and sent them to Tule Lake as a segregation center, as more of a prison than anything else. And this is located on the Oregon border. Okay. Now, I want to make quite clear that the majority of people who were removed into these concentration camps were from the American West Coast on the continent. Okay, not from the East Coast or the Midwest or or the South, and not from Hawaii, which I think is interesting because, again, where did the Japanese attack? Pearl Harbor, which is in Hawaii. Okay, at the time that Pearl Harbor occurred, the Japanese population in Hawaii was about 30% of the total population. Only 2,000 Japanese Americans, as I understand it, were removed from Hawaii and placed into concentration camps. And again, we beg the question, if Japanese Americans are such a threat, then why didn't we round up the 30% of Japanese Americans who populated Hawaii and put them into camps? Why only a fragment of the total population? Okay, and the answer to that, again, as I've probably made quite clear, is that the majority of animosity towards Japanese Americans was occurring on the American West Coast. Okay, all right, let's move on. All right, what you're seeing here is a map of the various concentration camps, and you can see there's a guide here for you that anywhere you see a dot, for example, on this map, that's where a WCCA Assembly Center was. Wherever you see a triangle, that's where the War Relocation Authority centers were, and those were the main concentration camps. And going from left to right, I'll start in California. We have Manzanar, which, if you look at California, you'll see Manzanar there towards the southern portion, and then if you go up north towards Oregon, you can get to Tule Lake. Okay, if you move just west of that, you hit Minidoka in Idaho and Heart Mountain in Wyoming. Okay, go down and you have Topaz in Utah, and there's 2 of them in Arizona. Go further south and you hit Poston, and then Gila River, both in the southwest portion of Arizona. Okay, then you have Granada. Okay, and then 2 over here if you go straight down south towards Louisiana, this deep south area, you got Rower and Jerome. Okay, and these are major concentration holding centers. This is where the people were held. Okay, and if you go over and look at Hawaii, you'll note that there was only a temporary camp or WRA facility in Hawaii. Okay, again, the majority of the holding centers were in California. All right, and that's an important observation. All right. Okay, let's move on. All right, it says that as the removal process continued under the authority of the WRA, again, that's the War Relocation Authority, significant numbers of Japanese Americans, predominantly West Coast Japanese Americans, were being removed from the West Coast and placed into the larger concentration camps. It says by August 18th, virtually all Japanese Americans, Issei and Nisei, had been expelled from California. The only Japanese Americans who were in California by August 18th, 1942 were placed in the Manzanar or Tule Lake concentration camps. It says the expulsion experience was wrought with humiliation, uncertainty, and a profound sense of loss, both for family members and personal property, right? Not only did Japanese Americans lose their property, but their entire world was upset by this, right? Within the Japanese family, the Japanese American family, there is a strict set of social conduct and hierarchy in the family. Okay? Filial piety, a deep sense of respect, all of this is overturned and undone when the Japanese are incarcerated and placed into these camps. And I think one of the ways that we can understand how this was upset and the uncertainty that it was brought on is by understanding the way that these evacuations were forced. This was a deliberate removal. Okay? In fact, Frank Miyamoto recollects, and he was a Nisei at the time. Well, he still is a Nisei, but at the time he was a child, and he wrote, people were asked, well, required, to assemble at certain places where they would be moved onto buses and so on. You've seen all these pictures of people, the evacuees, getting on buses to be shipped out of their community. And it was kind of a feeling of people that we were cattle being herded together, to be herded out of the community. It was a feeling, a very distressing feeling of being forced out of our home, forced out of what was our due rights, to ship onto via buses to God knows where. We didn't know where we were going, what we were going to have. So the attitude, I believe, was one of, and I'm quoting him specifically here. He says, that point at which we were loaded on buses and shipped out, I think that was one of the worst points of our experience. and that we got the sense of being, as I say, herded like cattle out of our homes and where we felt we had a right to be. Okay? You know, the War Relocation Authority and others called these individuals evacuees. They called it an internment. The reality is that the WRA used those terms to soften and hide what was actually going on. You read someone like Frank Miyamoto and he says, we were herded like cattle, we were forced, we were required. This does not sound like an evacuee he's going into an internment camp for their protection, right? This sounds like someone who's being forcefully removed from their home, forced to sell their property in very short measure. Okay? And that's why I think it's important to read what these Japanese Americans had to say, because it tells a very different story. Okay, he mentioned something about pictures. Let's take a look at a few. Okay, this one is an interesting photo. You see actually a lot of smiling faces, but on the far right of the photo you can see the trains that are coming up. But the striking component about this is I want you to take a look first at the barracks, right? These are hastily constructed barracks. Multiple families are going to live in those, and those are pretty typical of barracks that people lived in. In fact, if you have an opportunity to do so, and I would highly encourage you to do this, in Los Angeles, in Little Tokyo, there is a museum known as the Japanese American National Museum. And there they speak a great deal about this particular period of history as well as others. But when you walk into the museum, they actually have one of these barracks. It was from Hart Mountain, I believe, when they've cut the barrack in half so you can get a sense of what the barracks must have felt like to live in. So if you have an opportunity, go down to Little Tokyo, get yourself some fantastic sushi, okay, and spend some time at that museum learning about this, okay? But the barracks attest to the fact that this is not a pleasant place to be. But if you take a look at the fencing here, right, the fence is pushed sort of in towards the Japanese, right, with barbed wire, okay? That the fence is pointed towards, if you will, the Japanese, indicates that they are being imprisoned in there, that they are being held captive in there. Well, if these individuals are there for their own safety, if you know, as the government said, as Eisenhower said, that most of these people were loyal, then why are we acting and treating them as though they are prisoners? Okay, an interesting photograph. All right, this is another photograph. I believe this is of Manzanar concentration camp. And I find this a striking picture because here you have a concentration camp with the symbol of freedom and liberty, you know, surrounding it. Okay, you've got the flag, right, which is a representation of freedom, liberty, and all men are created equal except for those people who are in these camps, right, because they are somehow an enemy race, as DeWitt had said, right? It's a striking photograph, okay? You know, these photographs that you're looking at, they're just a smattering of the photographs that were taken of this period, right? There's many, many more of them. All right, let's move on. All right, it says throughout the evacuation process, or what I think is more accurately prescribed as the forced relocation process, but throughout this process, many families were forced to sell their homes, sell their farms, and were allowed to bring only that which could fit into a single suitcase, right? Okay, it says many families lost everything they had, and for the Nisei, they lost their civil liberties, right? They were American citizens, unable to reconcile. In fact, there was an American citizen who took this to court and said, hey, this is an unfair treatment of American citizens, and the court upheld it. The court said, no, this is an okay thing to do. Okay, it says prior to arriving at the camp, families were given numbers, and in this way Japanese families were organized and categorized as they entered the camp. It goes on to state that upon arrival, inmates were forced into hastily constructed barracks, and they soon discovered that privacy was a great luxury, right? You went to the restroom with other people, you got naked and dressed in front of other people, right? The entire social order, who was in charge, was turned upside down, and the reason for that was because many Nisei were viewed as, and they rightfully should have been, more Americanized, and so actually in the camps, the Nisei took on more of the familial responsibilities. They were seen as being better, quote unquote better by the guards and others because they could speak English and they were more Americanized, and so the whole social order of these Japanese families were turned on its head. Okay, turned on its head. It was a very difficult thing. It wasn't just that you were incarcerated, it was that your entire social order, the idea of respect and what it meant to be a family, was all challenged. Okay? And I don't think this is something that's talked about too much. There were many American citizens born in these camps. I know at least of one story where a woman gave birth to her son while in this camp, and he was born into his American citizenship in a concentration camp, held there by his own government. I mean, that's just, the irony is too thick there. Okay, you're free, but not really. Okay, moving on. All right, as you saw with the pictures, is the camps were fenced, and in each fenced camp there were block arrangements. Each block contained 14 barracks, 1 mess hall, and 1 recreational hall on the outside. On the inside was the ironing, laundry, and men and women's lavatories. Other places in the camp included dry and cold warehouses, a car and equipment repair and storage and administration, schools, canteens, a library, religious services, hospitals, and a post office. The reason I mention all that is to again stress the fact that life continued on in these camps. It wasn't like the ghettos or death camps where you just sat and worked and died, right? Life continued on. People had jobs, people sent letters, people had schools, people had school dances, there were athletic competitions, right? Some individuals were able to actually get leave permissions to be able to leave the camp and come back in the evening, right? Life went on. And to be honest, when the camps finally did close down at the end of the war, some Japanese Americans didn't want to leave. And that seems a striking thing, but they felt safe in these camps. Okay? Life did go on. Albeit you were locked up, but life went on. Okay? And that's an important reality to understand, that, you know, there is a hospital for you to go to. There are religious services for you to attend. There are schools for you to go to and learn, right? There are jobs that people can have. Okay? You can buy things like cigarettes and candy and other things, right? Incredibly significant. It says the people in the camps had to face various hardships, however, largely environmental hardships. It says many of the camps were located in the desert and faced unbearable temperatures. The average summer temperatures were over 100 degrees, and winter was no better, with winter temperatures falling to minus 30 degrees, at least in one of the camps. And the reality is those barracks, they're not insulated. They're not going to protect you from wind and sand. If it gets a sandstorm going, all that sand's going to come into your barrack. It's going to get all over the place, right? So it's cold. It's hot. It is relatively unbearable at times. Okay? But again, unbearable and difficult, yes. Extermination like the Nazis, no, that's not happening. Okay, it says meals in the camps contained meager portions. Fruit and vegetables were cultivated on the land. They used these to feed the people in the camp. They also used this for commercial consumption. They had livestock that was bred and raised on the land. This was also used for food. Okay. Now, the truth of the matter is that people were fed, and there were various mess halls. As you can see, each block had a mess hall. And, interestingly, people found out which mess halls had the better food, which mess halls, cooked food that was more to one's liking, to one's dietary needs. That was also a hardship, though, because many Issei who were accustomed to eating more traditional Japanese cuisine, they couldn't find that as readily in many of these camps. But, you could go from one mess hall to a next and find out which mess hall had the best food or the better cuisine or your dietary desires, right? I actually interviewed a Japanese American who was a chef or a cook in one of these mess halls, and he actually took a lot of pride in what he cooked. And he spent a lot of time talking about the various types of cuisines he would make and how that worked out. But just note that people are being fed. It's not like they're being fed 6 grams of bread every day and a cup of coffee, right? No, they are getting food, okay? And they are being treated relatively well, but again, held against their desires, right? Okay, moving on. Now here we see a photograph. I'm not sure which camp this is from, and it doesn't have a whole lot going on, but it seems so bleak, right? And that's why I show this picture here. It's just because it is so bleak, right? And when you are a Japanese American within this camp, right, this is sort of your window, if you will. This is what you get to see. Okay, off to the right of the picture there, you can see a gun tower, and those gun towers were always pointed inside the camp, not outside the camp. Again, if we're here for your protection, why are the gun towers inside the camp? Okay, interesting. Again, we see more photographs. This one's a little bit different. The fence still keeping them in. We can see that the barbed wire is intended to keep them in. All right. Now, one of the things that does happen is that around 1943, the War Relocation Authority, the War Department, and other agencies decide that they want to try and shut these camps down. They want to begin a gradual process, but before they can just shut them down and release everybody, they have to figure out who is loyal and who is disloyal. And in order to do that, these agencies create a questionnaire where the Japanese Americans Issei and Nisei were asked to fill out this questionnaire, and from this questionnaire these agencies were going to determine who was a loyal person and could be removed and allowed to go home, or who was disloyal. And if you were deemed to be disloyal, then you were sent to the Tule Lake Segregation Center. Okay, let's move on to the next photo, and I'll continue this story. Here we see the gun towers that still stand. So this questionnaire, there was a series of questions, but there was two questions in particular, questions 27 and 28, that posed many problems. Okay, to begin, many of the Japanese Americans had no idea why they were being asked to fill these questionnaires out. So they were unsure how to answer these questions, and oftentimes the way that they answered questions didn't necessarily reflect their honest opinions or ideas. But the two questions that were asked to both the Issei and the Nisei were: one, would you be willing to forswear allegiance to Japan? And two, would you be willing to serve in the American military? And that was specifically asked to the Nisei. And if you answered no to either of these questions, you were deemed a disloyal person. Now, this is a real problem, especially for the Issei, because if you're going to ask the Issei to forswear their allegiance to Japan, then they effectively become a person without a nation, because the United States will not allow them to become U.S. citizens. So they can't forswear allegiance to Japan, because to do so would make them a nationless person. So oftentimes they would say no. And if you said no to that, then the United States assumed that you were disloyal and wanted Japan to win. Well, you may not want that. You just may not want to lose your citizenship, right? The Nisei were also asked this question, and I think it's ridiculous because the Nisei never had any allegiance to Japan. So how or why would they forswear that allegiance? So they might say no, right? And then as far as serving in the military, while many of them did, I will say that many Japanese Americans, many Nisei did serve in the U.S. military during World War II. They made up the 100th Battalion, and they were largely used as interpreters, a highly decorated battalion. But some did choose to serve in the U.S. military, despite the fact that that same government had denied them their civil liberties and put them into camps, right? And many of them did that to prove to the United States that they were loyal. But many others simply said, no, I'm not going to serve the military while you're keeping me in camps. Or they would give a qualified answer, such as, no, yes, I will serve, but only when I get my civil liberties back, right? And if you happen to say no to these questions or qualify your answer, you were deemed a disloyal person and you were put in a segregation center. You were put in a Tule Lake. It's an incredibly horrific way to try to determine who is loyal, who is not, because in this segregation center at Tule Lake, everyone there was considered to be a disloyal American, and most were not disloyal to the United States. Okay? It's just interesting. All right, with all that said, let's move on. Okay, it says that while none were systematically killed in these camps as the Jews were in Poland, many within the camps did experience a good deal of violence and discrimination, as well as psychological trauma, violence, which oftentimes led to death. Okay? According to Minoru Kiyota, he wrote, "When I was transferred to Tule Lake," and again, this is that segregation center, right? We just mentioned this whole, are you loyal, are you disloyal? He said, when I was transferred to Tule Lake and saw these tanks and jeeps with mounted machine guns coming into the camps, I was mentally depressed and physically exhausted. He said, I told them that this is a country only for the white people. You people do not represent a democracy. And they shot at me 3 times with a .45 gun. Okay? So, particularly in this segregation center of Tule Lake, violence was more common because it was believed by the guards that these were disloyal people, that these were individuals who wanted Japan to win, and so they were treated more like prisoners of war than anything else, right? They weren't treated as American citizens. But what Minoru Kyoto suggests or forwards to us is that this was a man who was not disloyal. This was a man who was upset about the situation that his government forced him to be in. Okay? And these are important nuances and things to understand. Okay? All right, moving on. Now, eventually, the war comes to an end, and the camps will close. Tule Lake actually closes in 1946, so a year or so after the war comes to an end. But it says, after the Japanese were let out of the camps, a majority of them returned to the Pacific coast. Now, it's interesting because during the war, the United States passed a law, I believe it's Public Law 405, which allowed for somebody who was in the United States in a camp during a time of war to give up their citizenship. And if you gave up your citizenship, then you would have been expatriated, repatriated to Japan. 5,589 Japanese Nisei gave up their American citizenship, and they did so for a number of different reasons. And actually, the heart of my book, the heart of my master's thesis, asks that question. Why did the Nisei give up their citizenship? Why did they renounce their citizenship? And it is a very long, drawn-out answer to that question. But just recognize that 5,589 of them did renounce their citizenship to be sent back to Japan. Once the United States basically got unconditional surrender from Japan, those 5,589 immediately sought to get their citizenship reinstated. And in the end, after years and years and years and years of litigation, almost all of them did. Okay, so that's just sort of a digression and a side note and a further discussionary point if you're interested in why they would give up their citizenship and how and the process of getting it back. Please let me know. I'd be happy to elaborate on that. But that did occur during this time. But eventually the camps do close and they are returned to the Pacific coast, although there was an attempt to try and disperse them throughout the entire United States, and that's a problem too because their homes were in the West Coast, right? It says they began to start new lives and try to forget what happened. Many of them lost their land when they were brought to the camps, so when they returned, they tried to regain what they had lost, and unfortunately, many of them did not regain what they had lost. It says in 1948, Congress agreed to pay for some of their lost property. It says they began by giving the Japanese Americans less than 10 cents for each dollar they had lost. And that's a real slap in the face, right? We're the ones who put you into camp. We're the reasons why you lost your property, but we're going to give you a little bit back, but nowhere near the amount you had lost. It says by giving them back what they had lost was a beginning of saying we're sorry, albeit they didn't go far enough. It says also they started a Civil Liberties Act stating, quote, the Congress recognizes that, as described in the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, a grave injustice was done to both citizens and permanent residents of Japanese ancestry by the evacuation, relocation, and internment of civilians during World War II, right? The Congress says, look, there was a commission, and you can actually buy this commission and read it. It's pretty interesting, right? They say, based upon this commission, we understand that there was an injustice done. But if you go down here to the bottom, they are still utilizing the words to make it seem less severe than it was. Evacuation, which should be said forced migration, relocation, forced relocation, right? And internment, which should be called the concentration, right? Saying sorry wasn't enough in this situation, okay? But it's a beginning, I suspect, I guess. Okay, finally, and again, I could go on and on and on about this topic, but the final bow on this present, if you want to use that metaphor, happens in 1988. In 1988, during the administration of Ronald Reagan, the Civil Liberties Act is passed. And I think it's important to point out that the war ended in 1945. The last camp, Tule Lake, closed in 1946. It's not until 1988 that the Civil Liberties Act is passed. Now, what did it do? It said, among many other things, it issued an apology to all Japanese Americans incarcerated during World War II, right? We're sorry. This was an injustice. and it also offered monetary compensation to all surviving Japanese Americans, irrespective of their nationality, whether you were from Japan or from the United States. It says, while the apology was issued in 1988, the money, amounting to $20,000 per person, would not be handed out until 1990 under President George H.W. Bush's administration. Right? And of course, the story of the internment was not well known to many Nisei until many, many years later. Once the Japanese Americans were released, many Issei and some Nisei chose not to talk about it. They became what we call the model minority. They tried to assimilate deeply into American society to ensure that this type of thing didn't happen again. Right? It's an important story. I want you to click on this word administration. There's one more film I want you to watch. It's not very long. And just take a look at it and think through it, particularly what he says at the end, because he poses some important questions for us to think about. Okay? Now again, if this is an interesting subject to you, please let me know. You can read my book. You can read a host of other books. And please, if you have an opportunity, go down to Little Tokyo in LA and go to the Japanese American National Museum and further your exploration of this topic. All right, guys, have a blessed day.